Welcome to Oblong. If you can silence your cell phones. The events. Just have a couple of notes about upcoming events that we have. This weekend is Poughkeepsie Pride. We'll have a booth at Pride. Stop by. This Tuesday in the store we have Patricia Onaniwu Kashian, who has a new book called Forest Euphoria, which is about the abounding queerness in nature. And that's free. We would just ask you to register. Sunday the 22nd, Ashley Poston has her book launch for Sounds Like Love. That's at the Morton Library in Rhinecliff, and tickets for that are $20.55. That includes tax and a copy of her new book. And on Tuesday the 24th, we have John Wiswell in conversation here, and that is also free. He has a new book called Wearing the Lion, which is a reimagining of the Greek story of Heracles. Now, let's welcome John Seabrook, a longtime staff writer at The New Yorker. He's here to talk about his new book, The Spinach King. John is not really bringing his storytelling expertise to this story, but has a personal interest in it. So let's welcome John Seabrook.
Thank you very much. Yes, thanks for coming. I wanted to talk with you about my family and my book. I thought I would just start showing you a map of where the story takes place, because a lot of folks think they know New Jersey, but they actually don't know this part of New Jersey. It's like most people know, obviously, North Jersey, and then if they go down the Turnpike and they cross the Delaware Memorial Bridge, they go there. But if you kept going, you end up in this kind of dead end down here where you have the Delaware Bay kind of wrapping around, and it doesn't really go anywhere, and it's a little bit like the land that time forgot. In the 19th century, New Jersey was full of what they called market gardens. As a matter of fact, the reason that New Jersey is called the Garden State is because of all of the market gardens that used to exist in New Jersey. And market gardens were basically vegetable gardens growing high-end vegetables for Philadelphia and New York. This place was in a kind of a sweet spot because you could get the vegetables to Philly and to New York in a day. The reason that it was so fertile, and it is still so fertile, is because of a mineral they call marl down there, which for a long time farm boys have been digging out of pits and spraying it on the soil. Back in the 19th century, sometimes those farm boys would pull out large bones from these pits, having no idea what they were, until the first generation of American paleontologists came along and realized that they were dinosaur bones. And the very first dinosaur ever put on display was in the Philadelphia Academy of Sciences, 1868, called the Hadrosaurus, and it was from a marl pit in Haddonfield, New Jersey. So that's where the story takes place. My great-grandfather was an immigrant. As a child, he came from England. His father died when he was young, and he was apprenticed to a local market gardener, and he learned the trade of vegetable growing, and he became pretty good at it, quite good at it, and so he had a 60-acre farm and was a successful farmer. My grandfather was born in 1881, and he died in 1964. He never wanted to go into farming. He hated farming. He hated having dirt under his fingernails. He hated getting bitten by mosquitoes and all the things that one has to endure if one is even a backyard gardener. Because really, this is what it was. It was sort of backyard gardening on a commercial scale. He hated. He wanted to leave the farm as soon as he could, and become part of an industry. He wanted to be a builder, an industrialist. Henry Ford was his hero. Henry Ford was about 20 years older. And he was inspired by what he read of Henry Ford's factory in Detroit. But he happened to live at a time when horsepower was converting to machine power on the farm, and in the early 20th century he realized that instead of having to leave the farm for industry, he could bring industry to the farm. And so that was his great sort of vision throughout his life, was to create a vegetable factory modeled on the principles that Henry Ford had based his car factory on. A little bit of a crazy idea.
Can you try again? A headmaster had
I'm sorry, my phone, I shut it off, but
school administrator.
He thinks I'm talking to it. That's okay, don't worry about it. Sorry, sorry.
It's a crazy idea.
Oh yeah, a crazy idea. Like,
Yeah.
how do you industrialize vegetable growing? I mean, you can industrialize the processing, but you have to contend with nature, and it's not like cars where they're all mechanical parts, and nature doesn't really intervene that often. So it was a quixotic quest, I would say at best, but he was able to find investors in New York who were willing to buy into this idea. The idea of a mechanized farm was a potent idea in the early 20th century. It wasn't really clear how it would end, but there was a lot of promise in it. And my grandfather was able to attract investors in New York who put a lot of money into the farm. He cheated his father out of his half of the land. He didn't tell him that he had made this deal in New York and that the land was actually a lot more valuable than his father knew. And that actually kind of came back to, he dwelt on that as he got old, and guilt had a lot to do with the reason that the business eventually fell apart. At any rate, so he got the money, and during the First World War, food prices went up. The European crops were decimated. They counted on American producers, and food prices were high, so he did very well. He got labor from mainly the southern Italian immigrants that were coming in. The port of Gloucester was the second busiest port for immigration after New York, and a lot of Italians came through Gloucester, which was the Philadelphia port, and then they found their way, down to Seabrook, and they recruited from the docks. So they had people sort of hiring people right there. And my grandfather not only was their boss, but he was also their landlord. He built housing for the workers. He built a school for the workers, the town of Seabrook, New Jersey, which is what it is called to this day, was basically a company town, like a Pullman town, but it was a fairly large town. I mean, it had 5,000–6,000 people eventually, it had a hospital, it had its own police force. It was like a world completely run by Seabrooks, entirely set apart almost from the rest of the state, a world unto itself. So in the 20s, when food prices, after the war ended, food prices eventually collapsed. He lost the business, but he made friends with Clarence Birdseye in the late 20s. And so Clarence Birdseye had invented the quick freezing process some years before. Clarence Birdseye had been fishing with the Inuit above the Arctic Circle, and he had observed the fish pulled from the water, froze in the air, and then even days or weeks later were reanimated when they warmed them up, and they tasted just as fresh as if they'd been caught. In some cases, swam away, he claimed. And so he thought, if I could reproduce this process in a laboratory, I patent it, and away we go. And he did that for meat and for poultry and for fish. But vegetables were a little trickier. He didn't figure out vegetables. And since he knew my grandfather, and he knew my grandfather had this big farm, and it was kind of a scientific, innovative farm, he decided to ask him, he asked him if he could figure it out. And so my grandfather, who at this point had, so I'll just show you a couple of the pictures. My grandfather, here he is as a younger man, probably in the 1920s. But by this is from the picture from the 40s, but by the 30s he had 3 sons. You can see them all there. There's my grandfather. This is the oldest, Belford, the second one, and then Jack was my father. And so he and his 3 sons set to work on trying to figure out how to quick freeze vegetables using the patented process of bird's eye, and they did. They figured it out, and so they became the main supplier for bird's eye in the 1930s. And then when the war started, it was the Second World War, another great time for food prices. And also, it was a great time to promote frozen vegetables because the war effort, people were trying to conserve tin and metal, so domestic consumers were encouraged not to buy canned vegetables, but to buy these kind of newfangled frozen vegetables. It was a hard sell because most people associated frozen vegetables with spoiled vegetables. Because if you just stick your vegetables in a freezer, the cells burst and they're inedible. You can't just freeze vegetables. And so it took a while for them to understand that this was a different process, but the war really helped. And then after the war ended, the family started their own brand, which was called Seabrook Farms. And some of you might know the brand because it's still available today, even though it's not my family anymore. But it is, still quite popular with folks on the East Coast. So now they're real. So the 40s and then the 50s were really the most successful, the most historically productive time. Eventually, they froze 1/3 of all the vegetables in the United States. I mean, they became huge. I'll show you a picture of the factory because, and then the housing. So the workers' housing was just kind of built up in the fields, and it wasn't anything much. And then you had, then this is what the factory looked like. So it's really quite a stark industrial sort of thing in the middle of the bean fields of New Jersey. This smokestack was built by Grace Kelly's father, Jack Kelly, who was a builder in Philadelphia. And that's important because my father later met my mother at Grace Kelly's wedding, which I'll tell you about in a second. But that connection came through the building of this smokestack. I should also say that by now the labor situation had changed quite a lot. In the 20s, people got worried about too much immigration. There's a lot of fears that sometimes you see today were present there. And so there was shut down Italian, Southern Italian and Eastern immigration. But, and then in the 30s, black workers migrating up from the Jim Crow South came and worked at Seabrook Farms. And I'm going to talk about that too in a second. But then most significantly, during and after the war, when it became very difficult to find manpower on the farm, 2,000 Japanese Americans came from internment camps where they had been placed in the West after Pearl Harbor, the kind of hysteria that followed Pearl Harbor. And they were released to come and work at Seabrook Farms with their families. And so, and a lot of them went and a lot of them left after the war and went back to California when they were allowed to, but a number of them stayed, and there is actually to this day quite a significant Japanese American community down there in southern New Jersey. There's a Seabrook Buddhist temple. I'm actually speaking next month at the Oblong festival that the Buddhist temple puts on, which is an annual Buddhist celebration of redemption. And then after the war, he got about 900 Estonians released from displaced persons camps in Europe and sponsored them to come to the U.S. and they became U.S. citizens. And all of them lived at Seabrook too and became his tenants. This is a later shot of the housing, and that's the school right there. And you know, so it was a thriving multicultural community in the middle of an area that is really not the most progressive when it comes to different cultures and different races. But because the company really had a lot of control over the area, they were able to ensure that even the Japanese Americans who, this was during the Second World War, what are the reaction the local people going to be? But Seabrooks made sure that nothing untoward happened to those workers. But I think I'll also say that when the brand started, that's when I think some of the problems set in with the family, the relations with the father and the sons, which had a couple of different sources, but I'll try to talk about them. So when the Seabrook Farms brand started, the Seabrook family became the sort of brand ambassadors of it was the story of the father and his three sons that was kind of used to sell the product. And that story was embellished so that my grandfather eventually became an entirely self-made man, which he never was. I mean, his father really gave him a very good start. And in fact, his father was completely written out of the brand history. The story was that my grandfather had started farming on his own. The African American workers had never been treated as fairly as the white workers. Whenever a slack season came, they would be let go, even if they had seniority over the white workers, they would be let go first. And so in 1934, they decided to form a union and call a strike, which was an incredibly courageous thing to do. There had never been a union, there had never been a strike. No one had ever defied my grandfather. He was a completely autocratic ruler. And agricultural workers, as my friend here, Dan Kaufman, has written about, were never as well protected as industrial workers by the unions because it was difficult to sign up agricultural workers. They were often migrating from place to place. They didn't pay dues. And a lot of the laws that were passed exempted farm workers because people wanted farmers to have cheap farm workers so that there would be cheap food. Again, something happening still today. And so the African Americans, but the one piece of leverage that farm workers had was dealing with seasonal crops that, if they're not picked at a certain time, are going to rot in the fields. And so the African American workers decided that the beet crop harvest time was the time for their strike, and they called a strike. It went on for 11 days. It was covered in a number of different newspapers, including the New York Times. There were amazing photographs taken. In fact, there were amazing photographs taken of the farm at every era because the farm always had staff photographers. And then during the 30s and the 40s, the government hired some of the top photojournalists in the country to go around and document conditions on farms and factories. And so there were these great photographs. At any rate, the farm workers, the strike went on for 11 days, but my grandfather crushed it with violence. He brought in armed vigilantes And even the local KKK, if you can believe it, the New Jersey KKK were around back in the 30s, the 20s and the 30s. There's kind of a reflowering of, they call themselves the White Knights. It was a little bit, it's kind of a dress-up thing, really. They weren't sort of seriously violent, but they were very intimidating. Crosses were burned on the lawns of striking workers in Seabrook, New Jersey, in the 1930s. And so after that, the workers were all fired, and then really the African Americans were written out of the company history. Unlike the Japanese American and the Estonian workers, who not only were my grandfather's favorites, but after he died, they created a museum, which is there to this day, in which this kind of heroic narrative of my grandfather as a sort of a humanitarian capitalist was enshrined in brick and mortar. So, all of that happened, and I thought I would read you a little bit of sort of how things began to turn, at least in my mind, my views of the company began to change. So this is early in the book. Actually, one of my first memories. One of my earliest memories is of my father writing a eulogy for his father in the fall of 1964. Unlike in most families, the paper of record, that's the New York Times, had written the first draft. Charles F. Seabrook dies at 83, pioneer in quick frozen foods. Jersey farmer developed system with bird's eye, irrigated fields overhead. Irrigation was another one of his innovations. The New York Times obituary hadn't made the front page, which upset the family, but at least it was the lead item among the deaths the Times reported on October 21st, 1964, securing left-hand placement and more column inches than Anthony D. Francisci, the man who designed the World War II veterans' eagle in a circle insignia that GIs call the ruptured duck. Jack, my father, noted with pleasure the use of the present tense in the obit's headline, an honorific reserved for very important people, he said. The Seabrooks sweated those details. My father read aloud the whole obituary, which explained how Granddad had brought irrigation to South Jersey, led the transition from horsepower to manpower, and industrialized market gardening by introducing Henry Ford's assembly line to vegetable processing. Later, by pioneering quick frozen foods, C.F. Seabrook, quote, changed the eating habits of the nation, the paper said. In our family history, he was Thomas Edison and Henry Ford in the same Dagwood sandwich, a great American who had elevated us from dirt farmers to the ranks of industrialists in a single generation, hurdling the middle class without breaking stride. Much later, I would come to know the real story of how C.F. Seabrook became the farm boss of a baronial plantation in New Jersey. Ambition, energy, and ingenuity drove his rise, but violence and terror allowed him to maintain control. We often bury the details of how large fortunes are made, as the brutality underlying them is less inspiring to read about than eureka moments of accomplishment. Had the obituary writer checked the Times' own morgue, they would have found front page coverage of tear gas and billy clubs, mobsters and vigilantes, and the burning crosses of the KKK. So for me, I was born in 1959, the year that my family business exploded. My grandfather sold the business and he disowned his sons. This is a man who had been represented as a great family man, a man who had done so much for his children. He'd sent them all to expensive universities. He had a whole plan for leaving the company to them and then to future generations. But at some point, something happened, and instead of building the company, he basically destroyed the company. And my father was, out of a job, out of an inheritance, and out of a father, really, the year I was born in 1959. However, he never never let that show, and he never, in fact, he represented himself as basically inheriting his father's mantle as not as leader of Seabrook Farms because it was no longer around, but as a kind of a almost royal presence in South Jersey, and he reinforced that by my father. On the cover, you can see he's engaging in this activity called four-in-hand driving, which involves having 4 horses hitched to a road coach, holding the reins, wearing a top hat, and he would practice driving around the country lanes of New Jersey. And he had a road coach called the Nimrod, which was his pride and joy. And he was so enamored of, and Nimrod was is said to be in the Bible a hunter who became mighty in the earth. He's in Genesis. Some scholars think he was the first king. Some say he was the guy who built the Tower of Babel. Anyway, he was a very important guy, and my father felt that he was kind of an ally in some way of his. So he began to he changed all the license plates on his cars. Nimrod 1, Nimrod 2, Nimrod 3. Changed the name of our road to Nimrod Road. We had these glasses that had the word Nimrod on it that you would drink gin and tonics out of on the Nimrod. But I was going to read you what happened. You can perhaps guess what happened, but it was a very unfortunate co-branding choice. Unfortunately, as Jack Seabrook was aligning his personal brand with Nimrod, 20th century popular culture was transforming the name into an insult. The agent of this etymological cataclysm was Bugs Bunny, the wascally wabbit of Looney Tunes, Warner Brothers' long-running animated franchise. Bugs taunted his nearsighted nemesis, the hapless hunter Elmer Fudd, by calling him Nimrod. The show's fan base made "You Nimrod" into an all-purpose Gen X insult, free of racial or sexual overtones. By the 1980s, if you went for a drive with my parents in one of the Nimrod fleet, you could count on honking and flashing lights at the very least. More than once, they were mooned by real Nimrods. Bruce is my brother, and I tried to impress on our father the seriousness of the problem. Nimrod doesn't mean mighty warrior on earth or whatever anymore, Dad, I said. It means mighty doofus. I'm sorry, he said, is that the Looney Tunes translation of the Bible? He refused his tormentors even the slightest satisfaction, handling these mortifying highway encounters as Nimrod himself, son of Cush, might have, with the haughty disdain of the truly mighty of the earth. At any rate, so my father never talked about what had happened. He didn't represent his father as like the humanitarian man that the museum represented him as, but he never criticized him, and he never explained what had happened. So I grew up wanting to know what had happened between my father and his father, and I think it was really why I became a writer and a journalist. I was always asking questions. I was a lot of families have, the family historian that sort of wants to know the genealogy of the family. I was that guy. Turned out I had a whole set of cousins in England that I didn't know about, because another thing my grandfather had made up was he said we came from this sort of noble family in England, and we came from peasants. And it turned, there were a lot of them still over there, and I actually identified them. But I didn't have much luck with him. My mother, so my father was married when he was young. He had 2 daughters, my half-sisters, one of them still living. And then he had a period in the 50s where he was sort of a swinging bachelor. And his girlfriend, surprisingly, if you're a fan of Green Acres, or if you ever were, was Ava Gabor. Ava Gabor And 1951 was, you know, on the cover of Life magazine. She was, you know, the Gabor sisters were like the proto-Kardashians, really. You know, they were the first of those three sister acts that really, and you know, her sister, of course, Zsa Zsa was probably the most famous. Anyway, so she became my father's girlfriend, and the role she played on Green Acres, basically she lived 10 years before that as like the sophisticated New York person who would come down to the farm. I'll probably find a picture of her as I'm doing this. Here she is with my father. My father was a very handsome guy, but she was keen on actually. There she is with Seabrook Farms frozen food. You know, she was perfectly happy to promote the brand. And so they had a romance, and that was a big deal down there. And they broke up. You can, if you want to know the sordid details, you can read about them. It involved my grandfather. I'll just say that. But after that, so as I said, he knew the family knew the Kelly family from that smokestack, and when Grace Kelly got married, her family chartered the SS Constitution, which was, you know, an ocean liner, to take the wedding party and the press from New York to Monte Carlo for the wedding. My father was invited as a guest. My mother, who my father had never met at this point, my mother was from Spearfish, South Dakota, and she had come east during the war and gotten a job in journalism when men weren't around and women had a chance. And she became a very successful and pioneering woman journalist in New York in the late 40s and in the 50s, and eventually she had a column for United Press, and she wrote about celebrities and movie stars, and she had written about Grace Kelly. In fact, she broke the story of Grace Kelly's engagement, and that was a huge story in 1956, and so she was invited along on the ship. So here they are on the ship. She's with the press and he's with the guests. But really, they're the two most attractive people on the ship, except for the movie star herself. And so they meet, and here in fact, here's a picture of this is my mother here. They've given her a Super 8 camera to try. This is Grace Kelly, obviously, here. They've given her a Super 8 camera to try to take films. I had never been able to find the footage from it, but that's her trying to figure out how to work the camera on the ship. With the other members of the press. She had, this is a nice picture of her. She had covered Marilyn Monroe in 1956. You can just see her back here following Marilyn Monroe into a party event. She's almost sticking her pen in her ear practically, but yeah. So she was she was on the ship. My father was on the ship. Here's another picture of the press with Grace Kelly, and they met on the ship, and then they had this kind of parallel romance in Monte Carlo. And the best part of this story was, okay, so the film To Catch a Thief, which you probably all know, you know, with Cary Grant and Grace Kelly, and it's about a jewel thief in Monaco, a cat burglar. There was a real-life cat burglar who struck at the wedding and stole the jewels of one of the Philadelphia society ladies. And the palace knew that if the press ever got a hold of that story, it would be, you know, they would run with it. And so they put out the word that no one could talk about this. But my father, who at this point was sort of trying to impress my mother in any way that he could, had heard the story, and so he had lunch with my mother, and he said, if you can keep a secret, I'll tell you a story and you can have it. And she said, oh, I can keep a secret if it's for me. And so they said, well, you come with me, and the police were interviewing the woman, and he said, this is my assistant, and they went in, and she was taking notes. And then within an hour, the story was on the way to New York. It was like, of course, like the biggest story of the wedding. And what was particularly sweet about that was that all these big-time foreign correspondents had been sent to the wedding, grumbling about covering this society event, and she scooped all of them. And no one knew how she got the story, and no one else could get it, and so it was a triumph. And then they themselves were married about 6 months after the wedding. So my mother came down to South Jersey just as things are falling apart, and and she thought she was getting herself into like this kind of very elegant, aristocratic family, and she found herself in the middle of a nut house with this man who, there were a number of reasons. He had a medical event in the 40s. Maybe it was a stroke, and he never really recovered his full powers, and he relied on phenobarbital, which was a drug common in those days. And he really abused phenobarbital, and I think that had one thing to do with the crazy. Also, the brand, the Seabrook brand, although it represented a step ahead in that we were now actually had our names on a commodity, which in America is like kind of a weird form of an exalted status, and the more common the commodity, the better. But the brand actually undermined my grandfather's power structure, because that whole Henry Ford concept of it was everything in the same place, vertically integrated, from seed to frozen food package. It all happened there, and it was all under my grandfather's control. But when the brand started, and after the war, prices in California were cheaper than the East Coast. They started, and of course, then you're in the California market and in the Florida market. They started, having outlet processing facilities in those places. But my grandfather felt that that wasn't how the business should be run. And then my father really wanted to get into frozen orange juice, which was a big deal in the 50s. It was just coming in, and was a great idea. But my grandfather felt that frozen orange juice wasn't the family business. So I think that also undermined him. And then the third thing was that he was an uneducated man. He had never even been to high school. My father he'd gone to Princeton, and my father was 8 inches taller than my grandfather, and he was a very handsome guy. And he was friends with the investment bankers on the board, but my grandfather always resented the investment bankers being on the board, because he wanted to do things his way, and they didn't want him doing things his way. And so when an argument would come, he would accuse my father of siding with the investment bankers in a kind of a class solidarity. They were both kind of Ivy League types, and he felt, ostracized and excluded by them. So eventually, the bankers told my father and his brothers that in order to save the business, they had to have him committed, declared insane. And they tried that, and he was committed for a while. But he got out, a judge got him out, and then he basically, the only thing he really could do to get back at them was to sell the business. So he did. And so, yeah, I grew up in the wreckage of this, but it wasn't until my father died in 2009 that I really knew the full extent of what he had gone through in those final years at Seabrook Farms. He left me a box of stuff. I don't know, maybe all families have a box, that shows up after somebody dies, and it's full of stuff that maybe you didn't know about your family. And this box was full of the man inside this box was a monster. My grandfather, the man depicted by the documents inside this box, was so far removed from the man inside that museum that it was hard to reconcile the two. Most of those documents came from, because my father had been disowned and his brothers had been disowned, they tried to have the will thrown out by showing that my grandfather was not sane when he made the will, the final will. And to do that, they interviewed all these people who had been around him in his last decade. He had, he had a lot of staff, workers. He lived in the Engineers Club in New York, and a lot of those folks knew him. And so there were all these interviews depicting his behavior, which was very upsetting. The worst part of it was that sort of preying on female workers in the factory to get so that he would get them off the night shift and the day shift, for certain things. It was very dark, and my father never really said anything about this, and he just kind of left this stuff for me. But he knew I'm a journalist, I'm a writer. I had written a couple pieces about Seabrook Farms at that point. So, did he want me to write about this stuff? That was a question that I struggled with for years. I kind of, as I sort of slowly made my way through this stuff. And at first I really didn't think I would write about it, because even though that alternative narrative in the museum is in large part false, it gave hope to a lot of those people who came from the internment camps and from the displaced persons camps, that my grandfather to them represented a better American than the Americans that had put him in the camps, and he did represent, for the Estonians, he was a gateway to America, and although a lot of them arrived in Seabrook and found the barracks to be no better than the barracks in the camp that they left, still it represented a positive thing in their lives, and their own family histories were incorporated into this kind of glowing family history of my grandfather that had been constructed mainly by them. And so that was one reason I was reluctant to tear that narrative down. Another, and then you're writing about your family, and you're writing stuff that's not positive about your family. There's a sense of betrayal, a sense of, and since it's kind of about betrayal, how my grandfather betrayed my father, I wondered whether I was in some way sort of perpetuating this sort of cycle of betrayal. But eventually I decided that my children should know the true story, because I sort of feel that these unresolved traumas in families, and there was so much trauma associated with this, if they're not dealt with, I actually believe that things can be biologically passed down. Epigenetics is the name for that particular sort of, I don't know, it's a science but they believe that certain traumas and pain and certain kinds of pain actually manifest in your body and can be inherited by your children. I didn't want that happening. I didn't want them to inherit this alternative narrative of my grandfather, particularly after I adopted a black child from Haiti which I didn't really think about. Well, how would that child think about my family, now her family history? But as she got older and started to learn about American history, it really became a concern of mine that someone's going to tell her about what happened in her family history, and will it seem like I've lied to her or tried to conceal it? And so that was another reason that I wanted to tell the truth. I also felt like fake alternative facts, fake narratives by they don't really lead to a lot of good places, and there's more and more of them with AI and everything in the world. So I didn't want to, like, at least by not writing the book, contribute to that. And finally, after I read the stuff that my grandfather had done to my father, I was actually angry. I wanted revenge. I felt like he never stood up for himself, and maybe it was for noble reasons. Like, he felt that his grandfather was still great no matter what he had done to him. But I felt that the world needed to know what a hero my father had been in going through what he went through and trying to save the business, and although ultimately failing. So I wrote the book. It took a long time. It came out a couple weeks ago. My family is just kind of digesting it now. Both my parents, of course, are gone. They're long gone. That was one reason that I didn't write it sooner. I am now basically kind of the generation of oldsters. The rest of them are all gone. And my oldest sister, my half sister Carol, who's now 83, is still living and healthy, and she, was around for some of this stuff that I wasn't around for. But I didn't want to interview her because I felt like my perspective was going to be different from her perspective, and I wanted her to be able to say, I'm not part of this. But she was okay with it. She said, of course, I interpret certain events differently, but our relationship is more important than whatever those differences are, and I don't want to make I don't want the end of our time together to be consumed with bitterness, which is amazing of her. My brother, who is my my 2 years younger brother, my father had 3 children born on the same day. Another sort of odd aspect of my father. So we're both born on the same day. He hasn't said anything to me, but he hasn't said anything negative, at least. And I think it probably just probably that will be his response. And then I have cousins who are still in the business down in South Jersey. Which, if you're ever down that way, there is this museum, and as I said, there are amazing photographs. We did try to make a selection in here, and there are like about 30, 35 really great photographs in here, but there are more down there. Anyway, my cousins still, the oldest brother, Belford's son, started a new frozen food business down there in the 80s called Seabrook Brothers and Sons. They eventually bought the brand back from the company that my grandfather had sold it to, and so they pack Seabrook Farms frozen cream spinach, which is still the most popular product. And I have a feeling they hate the book, and I guess we're going to have to somehow deal with that. As I said, I'm going down there next month for this Buddhist celebration, which hopefully will be like an atmosphere of peace. But it could turn into something less than peace. So that's my presentation. The book has a lot in it. One of the things I like most about it is if you feel like sort of reading 100 years of American history, but reading it from the perspective of one family, my ancestors sort of line up into these kind of perfect. My great-grandfather was a farmer of 4 machines. My grandfather lived at a time when the farm turned to machine power. And then my father lived at a time when it was sort of the post-industrial branded, age, 50s, kind of pre-Madman era. And so you get these distinct eras in the development of our culture as seen through this one family, and then some of the conflicts in the generations you see too. So I hope you like it. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Will the book be in the museum gift shop?
It will be. In fact, I donated them 100 copies. Because I felt like, well, they might not buy it, but if they got 100 copies, they'll sell it. So they're very happy about that. I actually served as the president of the board of the nonprofit that runs the museum for 3 or 4 years during the process of the writing of this book. And I kind of tried narrative reform at that point. I had a new website done that told the story in a way that I thought was more appropriate or more accurate. But the rest of the board vetoed the website. The rest of the board is mainly made up of children of the workers. There's some Estonians, Japanese Americans, there's a German, so they're all, and another fascinating thing about this story is that the children who came with those workers loved their childhood experience at Seabrook because it was actually kind of a fun place. There were a lot of kids, a lot of space to run around, and the parents worked hard to make it seem like they were happy, even if they were very unhappy. And in fact, I think, as with my father, that generation didn't want to tell their children about the hardships that they had experienced because they wanted them to feel like America was, not that place, that it was a happier place. And so, those folks are going through some of the same kind of reformist narrative things that I've gone through, or not. So, we at least the black workers are now represented in the museum. We have changed that, and there's a lot of great photographs there now. And now we've collected a lot of the oral histories of the black workers, because that's another thing that the museum does. It collects oral histories of how people got to Seabrook. And so we have started that process, and now it's kind of caught on with the community there, and they're kind of doing it themselves. So yeah, there's reform, but there's also a hard and fast belief in that happier narrative. There's a film called The Paradox of Seabrook Farms that was made by an Estonian about the Estonian community at Seabrook Farms. That really goes right to the heart of the paradox is that the children loved it and the parents hated it, basically, or that the children thought it was a nice place and the parents thought it was a very hard place, and that's the paradox. So check it out if you're down that way. Dan is my former colleague from the New Yorker.
Yeah.
Dan fact-checked a piece that I wrote about looking for my British ancestors that is, a little bit of it is now in the book. And Dan's now moved up here.
And that was a wonderful piece, and the book is terrific. I encourage everyone to read it. Just had a question, did you know, before your father gave you that box, did you have any inkling about, the labor battles or anything like that?
I'm just going to show you a picture from the film. No, not, so when I was, here's a picture of the children at Seabrook Farms, which looks like an absolutely utopian, multicultural, wonderful Disneyland kind of, we're all one experience. But for the parents, it was a very different experience. When I was working on the very first piece for the New Yorker that I wrote about this, I was 35 years old. I had never heard of the strike. Not a word had been mentioned by anyone in my family or anyone I grew up with. It had been 40 years or so earlier, but still, it was a cataclysmic event in New Jersey and in labor politics. And eventually did yield a union, and my father was instrumental in creating a union after the war, which was another sore point with his father. But no, the only thing I knew was that when I mentioned to a friend of mine who worked at The Nation, she it jogged something in her mind, and she went and she found in the archive a piece that had been written in August of 1934 that detailed the strike, and also said that my Uncle Belford, who was kind of, you know, my beloved uncle, had thrown a bomb into these workers' housing with women and children in the house and set it on fire, and they barely escaped with their lives. That was like a mind-blowing thing.
Was that before you'd written the first piece? Or?
I mentioned that in the piece.
Oh.
I quoted from the article, and my other sister, who's no longer living, really never spoke to me again after that. She didn't speak to any of us really, but I was particularly singled out for her scorn and, well, she just thought it was a horrible betrayal of the family. But you know, I learned much more about it from the writing of this book. If I'd done it earlier, I wouldn't have had all these digital versions of the local newspaper coverage that got put on newspapers.com, because every small town had a newspaper. You know, Millville had one, Vineland had one, Bridgeton had one, Salem had one, and you know, they were daily papers, but there was no way to search them. There was no way to even know where they were until they started showing up on newspapers.com, and then you could search on, you know, Seabrook Farms strike and get like daily on the ground reporting of what went down on that particular day. It was like a feast that didn't used to exist before. It's incredible. Yeah.
I have a question. You mentioned you didn't interview your half-sister. What were the other differences in approaching this book, you know, as opposed to your previous books, since it was so personal?
Yes, it's a great question. So this is like a reported memoir. So it's a little bit sort of across two genres. It's the biography of my family, but it also has my perspective and the experience of coming upon this information and the way it transformed what I had thought about my family, and the struggle with trying to reconcile that with, you know, my beliefs. So, you know, it was the memoir part of it that made it really hard. Like I knew how to do, you know, sort of reported books, and I often use myself as kind of a guide in my reporting, just sort of as a way of sort of giving you a frame for the piece or the book. But I don't really talk about my feelings or, you know, what I think. But here I was sort of necessarily having to do that, but I didn't want to do it so much that it interfered with the story of my family, and I didn't want to get in the way, right? So that was really challenging, finding that right balance. When I started the book, I thought I should just start like historically at the beginning, like when my great-grandfather arrived. You just sort of tell it straight through that way, and I did write a draft that way, but it didn't really make sense, because where am I in it? You know, you sort of wanted to know. So I ended up sort of starting with my father and me in 1994. It starts with my father trying to write a speech for the 50th anniversary of that museum, the beginning of the museum, and the speech was supposed to be about his father's great qualities and what made him such a great man. And he was unable to do it. He was blocked, and I sort of knew why, but I didn't know everything I knew now, but I knew there was obviously like a lot of pain associated with his father that he just couldn't deal with. And so that's where the book starts, with me realizing there's more, and then trying to help him get to it, but only partly succeeding, and then eventually kind of doing it myself. So yeah, it was a challenging mix of the personal and the kind of reported. Yeah.
Fascinating. All right, any more questions?
in the box that you got from your father, were there his own notes in them, stories like diary entries, or was it
Yeah,
clippings?
no,
or-
he never kept like diaries in which you like share your feelings, but he kept very meticulous office diaries where he documented everything, every phone call, and he had a secretary who typed up his notes every year and indexed them. So there were the 1,000-page office diaries for each year, like in the busiest years, where you knew, and it wasn't just business stuff too, it was also like his social life. So his girlfriends, their phone numbers, you know, the restaurants they went to, you know, and then the various discussions they had about the business with his brothers. His oldest brother, Belford, had washed his hands of their father. When Belford said during the war, I want to enlist, his father went ballistic. His father said, his father said, you're betraying me for our country. He put himself above America, really, that his son couldn't leave for his country because he was betraying his father. But he did leave and went to war and distinguished himself. And after that, he was basically out of it. But he left a bunch of notes that were much more pointed in his critiques of their father than my father did, and those were in the box too. And also the letters that my mother wrote before she met my father, and then up to meeting my father, and then in the early years in Seabrook, she wrote these incredible letters to, because her mother was in St. Louis by that point, and her sister was in New Orleans, and she was a journalist, so she had carbon paper. So she would type a letter with carbon paper, send one copy to her mother, send the other copy to her sister, and then keep the original. And so all those original letters came to me, and it was incredible. It was like, because her voice is so strong and it's so beautiful. You can see it if you read it. And so to have that, and to have it like almost like you're reading it in real time. This stuff is like she's writing these letters, like three of them a week, where she's just met my dad. This was the very first time she went down to Seabrook, and she didn't wear a hat, and that was a huge violation of coaching etiquette. Everyone has to wear a hat, and so there are all these like letters about that. Like she have a hat, and she's got to go find a hat because they're going back, and it was just wonderful. So the box was full of a bunch of different stuff. It wasn't just all these documents that my father had collected to throw out the will. Yeah, it was quite a family tour in there.
One last question. Did the farm have any influence on Popeye's desire to only eat spinach? Because he came out in '33.
Okay, I really would love to use this occasion to dispel what seems to be a conspiracy theory about Popeye. And it just came up this morning in a radio interview. A lot of people seem to think that Popeye was created by the spinach industry to sell spinach. And a lot of people also seem to think that the reason spinach was thought to be such a potent vegetable was because the USDA made a decimal error when they listed the iron content of spinach, and it was 10 times higher than it really is. But all that, and it's amazing, a lot of people think that, somehow that came from, but no, that's not true.
I didn't think that. I just thought it was an incident.
No, I know, you didn't think it, but it's amazing. No, Popeye was a total coincidence. Actually, I think when Popeye started, it was in 1929. And it was like a King Features cartoon. And originally, he didn't get his magical powers from a can of spinach. He got it from rubbing somebody's head, like the top of somebody's head. I guess, like, the image of him squeezing the can and the spinach popping out was too good to resist. But, yeah, it had nothing to do with my family, although maybe they, and in fact, I never heard my family mention Popeye. So, I don't know, maybe they just didn't like Popeye.
All right, well, thank you very much.